Welcome, everybody, to the Alternative Ideas, the AI podcast. My name is Jonathan Brush, and I'm your host, along with David Rethemeyer. David, welcome.
Well, thank you. And thank you guys for joining us. For those of you who might be new here, this is the 9th episode, and we're going to be wrapping up this season of the Alternative Ideas podcast with this episode, where we are looking at artificial intelligence and some of the developments and news happening around it. But we're offering a little bit of a different perspective, not only just from just some of the generational differences and just the different perspectives that Jonathan and I come from as individuals, but also just from a different perspective than most of the news articles and sources that you might be looking at about AI have had, and hopefully have given you some alternative ideas on what AI might look like for you, the everyday person.
And the last couple episodes, David, we've been joking that we've been a little pessimistic. We've had some content that was maybe a little more troubling than exciting. But this episode is a little bit of a turn. There is some pretty interesting articles that we looked at this week, I think most of which are in a very positive vein. They bring up some pretty interesting points. And I know some of the things I learned from these articles prompted some new thinking for me and some new understandings of AI. And so there's some, and maybe some new uses for it as well. So if you've slogged through the last two episodes in terms of some of the things that we talked about that were a little bit more scary, hopefully this is a bit of a turn back to some positive aspects of AI that I think both David and I are excited about. And honestly, David, yours is more exciting than mine, just in terms of sheer, good for the human race, I think. And so tell us about the article that you found, the stuff that you were researching this week.
Yeah. And so just for your reference, if you're listening, any of the articles and things that we talk about in the show today will be in the description down below. But this one that I came across was from The Guardian. And basically, it's talking about how there was a recent study done where they were using AI to assist radiologists who were scanning for breast cancer. And the results were really shocking in that it sums up to be that the AI being implemented versus just the radiologist doing all of the work essentially doubles the efficiency that radiologists are able to have. And this is not a small study. This was a randomized trial that involved over 80,000 screenings over the past few months. And the AI did not generate any more false positives than a standard radiologist would. So it is dramatically increasing efficiency for radiologists in the way that it's able to be implemented and look for the patterns of signs of breast cancer and be able to catch it earlier. And it's, reducing how much the radiologists, how much of the tedious work that they have to do. And so, all in all, I think this is just of the uses I've seen of AI and just the good that it has the potential to do for just quality of life, literally. I think this is one of the most exciting things I've read so far.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And to some extent, I think, David, it's the kind of thing that we sort of say, like, we want computers to do. I mean, we know that at some level, there's an awful lot of human error in medical treatment, and things get missed and false positives and all these kinds of things. And that's, I think, because there's something inherently inhuman about, long-term repetitive tasks and looking for anomalies and things like that, which is not to say people can't do it and do it very well. And some people are predisposed to do better at that than others. But there is some element of that is repetitive and boring and really difficult for humans to remain focused on. And so it sort of seems to make logical sense that AI would be good at this thing. And I think these kinds of applications are really the tip of the iceberg. I think this is something we haven't talked about, but it seems to me, and listeners, take this with a grain of salt, because I'm neither a doctor nor a medical expert nor a computer expert. But having watched technological advancements in the past, I think that we're likely to see some pretty significant medical gains that result in a lot of saved lives and improved care as AI and medical stuff integrate. And there, of course, is going to be privacy concerns and things like that. But I think this article is really interesting in terms of some of the positives that we're going to see from that. And I think you'll see this is kind of the tip of the iceberg in some of those applications. And that's exciting. That's good for everybody. Cancer is a scary thing. And to some extent, every year you don't have cancer, you kind of are winning the technology race, because every year we get a little better at treating and a little better at diagnosing and a little better at screening and all those kinds of things. And this kind of thing is sort of a leaps and bounds gain. So I think it's quite exciting, David.
Yeah, yeah. And I think especially for the way that AI can really be useful in a medical profession is in sort of this kind of application where it's really just looking for patterns in data, I think is one of the most helpful things they can do, because that's what especially large language models like the big ones that we have been seeing advances in are really good at, is just taking in a large amount of data that is very complex and being able to find specific things that you set the parameters that it's looking for, such as detecting for certain things in scans and in mammograms and things like that. And so I think, yeah, that you're completely right that this has a lot of potential to have a lot of really big advancements as far as just data analytics in the medical field, and how not only are we able to refine current processes for diagnosing things in the immediate, but also in research. And so, I could go so far as to say, I think that the integration of AI and being able to look at big sets of data could advance towards even helping us to cure long-term chronic illnesses and things like cancer. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the articles I read this week had a line that it was a minor point. It wasn't the main point of the thesis of the article, but it was something along the lines of how large language learning models work. And the argument here was that this is basically just a logic machine. And so we took a stab, I think maybe in the first episode of trying to do a bit of an explanation of how AI worked. And I think there was an interesting thing as I read this section, David, that I went, oh, you know what? I've kind of picked up a few pieces of baggage that I don't think are really helpful here. And I'll tell you what my baggage was. And you can see, maybe, David, you've got a little more technical brain. You can help me sort of decipher this a little bit.
Okay. I
think when I've read about AI, especially initially, there was a lot of really interesting stories about runaway AIs. AIs that reprogrammed themselves to AIs from Google that were talking to each other and had to be shut down because they were doing things that the developers didn't understand, all this stuff. And so there's this kind of runaway monster in the machine type of idea that makes AI, I think, subconsciously made AI to me much more scary and kind of unfathomable. Because there's this one story where it's like the engineer's like, we don't know what's happening here. Well, that's an interesting thing. You could have somebody working on the space shuttle that says, I don't know what's happening here. That doesn't mean the space shuttle is alive. It just means that something happened mechanically that they didn't understand why it happened, and they have to go back and figure it out. Total aside, I had a weed trimmer that was not that old, and I was using it a month or so ago, and it just popped and stopped running. And it was the kind of pop that I was like, that's probably not a good pop. And then the cord was locked, and so I happened to be going into the shop anyhow for something else. So I took this in and said, hey, take a look at this. And I just happened to call him today, and he's like, yeah, the flywheel or the coil, something must have got in there, and it jammed it, and it stopped. And when it stopped, it ripped the piston head right off of the thing and blew up the case and everything else. And he said, I've never seen anything like that before. And he says, and I'm not sure what caused it. Okay, well, that's interesting. The inference is not that a gremlin got into my trimmer and blew the thing up, right? Like that a little gnome got in there and set off a set of dynamite. I mean, the inference is something that is unexplainable happened to cause a catastrophic failure that has cost me a trimmer, which is annoying. But he's like, it's not likely to happen again. It's not because you did anything wrong. I don't know what caused it. Something probably got in there and jammed it, but I don't even know how that's possible. Okay, so he's saying, my professional expertise says I don't know what caused this, but something caused it that was mechanical, but it's an unknown. And it's going to probably remain unknown. I was thinking of that because that happened just a little bit ago, David. I was thinking about that in relation to this thing. And I thought, there's something going on like that. There's people saying something mechanically is going different here. I don't know what it is. And it's either breaking or doing better or something like that. I'm not fully understanding exactly the process of how it's working. But that's different from the machine came alive, which is what I think people jump to with AI. So that was a long end around to get back to this statement, but this person said it's a logic machine. So if I said Mary had a little, what's your first word that you got to put in there, David?
Lamb.
Right, absolutely. And they said that's exactly what happens. Your brain went through and says, I've heard this pattern a million billion times in my lifetime. And Mary could have a little teapot. Mary could have a little car, Mary could have a little dog, Mary could have a little cat. But we know that the most likely thing is Mary had a little lamb. And so what large language learning models do is that they have just got a huge data set and fast computing power that says out of all the combinations of these words, and when I look at all the different combinations of these words that I've been exposed to, I run a probability machine across these things and say 90% of the time, this is the word that goes in here. And then it's 99% if you look at the words that precede it, and it's 99.9% if you look at the words here. And so consequently, it must be this word. I don't know why, David, but for some reason, that's eminently logical. It makes sense. And when I read it, I was like, yeah, I guess I kind of knew that, but I didn't really. And so for some reason, that sort of brought into some definition, some lines here of saying, okay, yeah, this is a better understanding of how a machine works. So I don't know if that's a good explanation, or if that tracks a little bit logically with, some of your more technical ability. But I thought that was interesting, and the juxtaposition of that, thinking about that versus the mechanic telling me today, I don't know why this broke, but it broke. It's like, I don't know why the machine's doing this, but it's a machine. So
yeah. I think that there is something comforting to just recognizing the fact that ultimately it is a machine, it is a program, it is not something that is so infinitely complex that you're completely unable to understand it. It might be something where you get a result like you did with your trimmer, where you're like, okay, I don't, at least from the outset, understand it, but I can understand the system surrounding it well enough that if I did enough investigating, and if I was able to determine all of the circumstances that happened around it, I could probably at very least come to a good guess as to the most likely reason for why this happened the way it did. And I think that a lot of people, just because of the way that we have absorbed media regarding AI, will just jump straight to Terminator and HAL 9000 and all that, and say, well, at that point, it just has a brain of its own, and it's completely independent, and is so complex that nobody can understand it. There are some instances where you have people who work with AI saying, I don't understand how AI came to this conclusion, but I think that explanation that you offer helps when you can hear people say, I don't understand this. It's not a I don't think this can be understood. It's more of a, I don't quite understand fully all of the circumstances that led to this yet.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting piece there, because you said that at some level, when things go wrong, you go back and say, what happened? And with AI, you do get to a point where it's like the variables are so large that you can't really do that. But that's not untrue in other things. And so I was thinking about this, and some mechanic said, he says, so it's not like you ran straight gas in it and blew it up. Now, for those of you who don't run two-cycle motors, right? I mean, there's certain two-cycle motor. Well, as far as I know, all two-cycle motors, you have to mix oil and the gasoline. So there's no separate oil stuff. The oil's in the gasoline. You have to mix it and then put it in. If you would run one of those with just straight gas, it will have no oil to lubricate the engine, and it will build up heat, and then it'll build up friction, and it will eventually crack the case. It'll blow up. Now, it doesn't blow up like a bomb. It basically pops and stops working because you've fractured the case or thrown a piston or something like that.
Right.
And so what's interesting is he's saying, I see this a lot. And so if I see a cracked case and then I look and I say there's no oil in there, then I go, okay, well, somebody put straight gas in here, mixed no oil, heat buildup. I can't specifically tell you exactly, right down to the molecular level what happened, but I can tell you in general, I know exactly what happens because this happens every single time these things happen. And there's things like that in AI. The machine was biased, or the machine was whatever. It's like, well, you can go back and see some big stuff. But then you live in a world that has a lot of variety in it. And so at some point you come to sort of if it's not infinite, it's infinite, practically infinite amount of variables that are not worth tracking. So in this case, the guy was like, something impeded the ignition coils turning. Or it could be that something was on the flywheel. It could be that an outside stick or a pebble got in there, something like that. But now we're talking about an infinite amount of but the shrapnel from the thing flying apart means that it was impossible to really tell if it was the flywheel. And so it could have been an outside thing, but when it broke, it could have ejected that outside thing. So the result is this. We know what happened. The ignition coil stopped spinning and then ripped everything apart. But then figuring out exactly what variable got introduced that caused it to stop spinning that's somewhat a futile operation, right? I mean, like there's so many varieties there, and answering it doesn't necessarily help us. Now, that's not a perfect analogy to AI, but there's a point of AI where it's like there's things going on here that we could perhaps reverse engineer, but there's so many variables, there's so many logic things being happen. It's almost an infinite possibility. It's not worth the time to figure it out. Okay, so the analogy breaks down a little bit because the implications of my trimmer breaking do not necessarily threaten world security or somebody's health.
Right.
The implications of AI breaking does have that. So I'm not ignoring that. But at some level, it was a little bit comforting and helpful to me to think that this is the same kind of machine. Like it is a machine. There are some variables. Some of those variables are traceable. Some of them are not. But at heart, this thing is running on the same general principles as a trimmer, in the sense that it's a machine created by humans, and it certain things go in it and certain outputs come out, and it converts things in certain ways. And that's kind of a helpful thing to sort of keep in mind, that it is machine learning, maybe more than the artificial intelligence has got a little bit of an alien ring to it. Machine learning kind of is back to what it actually is really doing. So
at the end of the day, it is a system that can be understood.
Right. And I think that was kind of interesting. So
yeah.
Well, did you have another article, David, or was that your big one?
I think that's the main one I was wanting to talk about. And so you had an interesting article as well that I think has a more positive spin. I think, if nothing else, a more positive spin for those who are a fan of some certain authors and potentially might find it really cool, might find it a little bit strange. So break this down for us, because I hadn't heard about this until you mentioned it.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So credit where credit's due. This is the initiator of this, the guy that builds these things, is called Derek Schurman, like SCHUURMAN. So I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that exactly correct. Make sure we give credit to him. And I heard the story on The World and Everything in It, which is a really fantastic news podcast put out by the World News Group. If you're not a fan, if you're not somebody who listens to that, I will just give it my highest endorsement. It is a very good news program and news company that tells it from an unapologetically Christian worldview. So heads up, if you're not Christian, they're going to come from that perspective. But I think they do it in a really good, honest way, in the sense that it's the bias is admitted and it's up front, and that it's easy to see. And I've really appreciated. They have a magazine that I've subscribed to for years, but they have this daily podcast that I think is really, really good, called The World and Everything in It. And this article appeared on The World and Everything in It today, and we'll have links in the transcript, links below to the transcript of that article. But so here's the article. Sherman is taken as a computer scientist by trade. And he's taken the large language model ChatGPT, and he's trained it. And Dave and I were talking before we started recording about how he did this, and we're not entirely sure. David, what was your best explanation? He took the API and did some programming work on it. Is that the way you set it up?
Yeah, long story short, since the ChatGPT API has been released, now people are able to take the logic, the system that allows ChatGPT to do what it does, and they're able to essentially configure it so that when they have their own set of data, they're able to get it to fulfill much more specific purposes, rather than relying on the infrastructure that OpenAI has set up with their massive data set.
Yeah, and so there's a whole lot that we can talk about here in a minute. But so the first thing that was fascinating here is this guy basically is taking it, and in his case, taking old Christian theologians, inputting that as the data set. And then the result of that, if you think about this, like, again, this is one of those things that when you think about it, you go, oh, it makes sense. The result of it is that since then the language model uses that data set, you can basically talk to that person. And so started with a somewhat lesser known Dutch theologian named Abraham Kuyper. Did it first with him, and then more recently and perhaps famously has done it for J.R. Tolkien, John Calvin, and the article in World and Everything in It had to do with C.S. Lewis. And so it was really fascinating. The reporter was basically asking, out loud questions of C.S. Lewis, quote unquote, and in a voice that sounded faintly English and a lot like C.S. Lewis's voice, at least as you might imagine it to be. The AI was answering, and the answers giving sounds tremendously like Lewis, which makes sense because I assume what has happened is it's been fed Lewis's entire works of books and letters, and there's quite a huge body of work that you could feed a machine. So the Sherman is sort of touting this as a way to use AI as an educational tool. what would it be like to be able to talk to an ancient author and ask them about their ideas and all those kinds of things? And then basically AI brings them back to life in some sense, in the sense that it uses their own words and their own thoughts and then reconfigures them in a way that sounds like and acts like having a conversation. So I think that's fascinating. I mean, like I'm pretty curious. I haven't tried it yet, but it would be really interesting to go have a chatbot discussion with J.R. Tolkien or with C.S. Lewis. So in that sense, there's a little bit of a gee whiz kind of interesting part of it. But there's also some interesting implications from an educational standpoint, which we know something about since we work for an education company. And I can see where that would be an educational process to have that conversation. But David, I actually went a different direction. And to me, and so give me your perspective on this, this is actually a much more fascinating way to use AI than what people are currently using AI. I feel like the sort of popular way to use AI and ChatGPT specifically right now is like an enhanced search engine. So I go to the internet, I type something into Google. Now I go to ChatGPT and I'm expecting a much richer, nuanced, layered response to my search queries, basically, which for reasons we'll talk about in a second, I have not found to be particularly helpful personally. But this idea of a closed AI that it was fed a specific data set and then is able to kind of reimagine and reorganize that data set in a way that makes it a conversation to talk about, I think that's a pretty fascinating application. This feels to me, if you've been with us listeners for a while, this feels to me a little bit more like the Star Wars droids that we've used, or I've used several times as an example of, maybe the more benign side of AI. So what do you think, David? Give me your opinion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. And I think that, it has some really interesting implications, and I think that it can be really neat. But I do think that it definitely has its limits. And just because when you hear that there is a chatbot that would allow you to talk to C.S. Lewis and have a conversation with C.S. Lewis, really what you are getting, what you have to understand that you're getting, is that you're just talking to a system that is just taking all the information that it has available about and from C.S. Lewis directly. That does not mean that you are talking to a replication of C.S. Lewis as a person. And I think this is a pretty important distinction, that if you can't look at what a chatbot like that comes up with as gospel truth and rely upon it and tout it nearly as much as you can the actual live works. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial take, but I think it's a useful thing to keep in mind with something like this, as the article reading through it says that, it talked about from Lewis's perspective, the bot had a hallucination where it talked about Lewis talking about his perspective being married again, but he was only ever married once.
Yeah,
so,
I was actually going to highlight that. That was the thing I mentioned earlier, David. And actually, it might be worth just reading from the transcript here. The reporter says, still, ChatGPT does make mistakes. I asked the Lewis chatbot why C.S. Lewis married his wife, Joy Davidman, and this is part of its answer. So the chatbot responds, we realized that our connection was much more than just friendship, despite our age difference and the fact that I had never contemplated marrying again after the loss of my beloved wife. Joy and I fell deeply in love. Okay, now the reporter picks up here and said, that's not true. C.S. Lewis was only married once to Joy, and she's the one who died. When ChatGPT makes up information like this, developers call it hallucinating. It's a major limitation of the technology. Well, that's the understatement of the article.
Yeah.
That's why, as I said earlier, I'm less infatuated with ChatGPT as a search engine, because I honestly don't have much confidence at all in the responses unless I already know the answer. And so when I go to Google, I generally don't know the answer. And then I'm using my own intelligence to sort through, not that everything you Google is correct, but to sort through various sources. And this happened in church actually last Sunday, David. We had a discussion after church, and for some reason we talked, the sermon had been about Jonah, and the book of Jonah had been read, and we were talking about Jonah. And I'd said, I'd seen a news story several years ago about ISIS had blown up Jonah's tomb, and it caught my attention because I was like, I didn't know Jonah's tomb was a thing, that it was known, and where was it, stuff. And so, got out the phone and Googled Jonah's tomb and quickly sort of sorted through some different articles that said the tomb that I was thinking about had been close to the present day Mosul, but there was actually several claims of different tombs and all those kinds of things. Yeah, and that's what the internet is fascinating for. In less than 5 minutes, I had a bunch of pretty decent sources. Wasn't ready to write a research paper to be published, but had enough context and information to be reasonably sure that I was giving generally accurate information into our discussion, which then turned upon this information about Jonah's tomb that we just discovered. Now, if I had put into ChatGPT, tell me about Jonah's tomb, I would not have trusted the results because it so frequently hallucinates. You're likely to come up with a bunch of stuff that is just complete garbage. So that's where David, I find this fascinating, not because I'm interested in a chatbot to discuss with C.S. Lewis, although that's got a kind of a gee whiz, ain't that cool sort of thing. I'm much more interested in this as its own tool. As somebody who works with a lot of content and as a company that does a lot of content and develops content, I think it's rather fascinating the implications that you could take and seal off AI and feed it all your own information, stuff that and then let it resort and represent that information in new ways. That seems to me to be a really powerful tool. And there was a phrase that I just thought was fascinating here, used in this one article called ChatGPT and the Rise of AI by Sherman. And let me see if I can scroll down and find it here, David. It says Fred Brooks, who he identifies as a respected Christian computer scientist, never heard of him before, so there you go, wrote, "It's time to recognize that the original goals of AI were not merely extremely difficult. They were goals that, although glamorous and motivating, sent the discipline off in the wrong direction." And then that was more in context of the rest of the article, and that's interesting. But this next line it sets up is really interesting. Brooks advocates for IA, so instead of AI, IA. And then that's defined as intelligence amplifying systems over AI, suggesting people and machines will be able to do far more than AI alone. And then he has an example. One of my colleagues at Calvin University has been exploring the use of AI for helping people write better as opposed to writing for them. Okay, I thought this phrase was fascinating, David. Intelligence amplifying, which is basically taking these tools and instead of using it as standalone content developers or even returning factual information like a search engine, instead amplifying something that's already been working on and being able to use it in a new way. So anyhow, I just thought that phrase is really, really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept. I really like the idea because it pretty much lines up with a lot of what we've talked about here on this podcast about what the proper use of technology should be. And that is to take the things that you as a human are already capable of doing and making them either more efficient or better, or allowing you to do more of the more significant, important things that you as a human were created to do rather than more menial tasks. And so I think that really lines up with that. I guess it's just so much of a difference from what the AI models that most people are familiar with now do. And really just how large language models and things like that work is just by getting fed a bunch of content and then being really good at reproducing new content based on all of the content that it already had access to. And so I think if we want to head in that direction, which I think that there's a very good argument for us doing, you would really have to make a very concerted push for that. And you would really have to determine what that looks like practically and how it can practically benefit people. I haven't looked a whole lot into this concept. You telling me about this here is the first time I'm hearing about it, but I would be very curious to see how it could be practically implemented, such as that example of how it would help a student to write something rather than actually writing something for them, because I think that there could be potentially some gray areas in there where it could try to give examples, but not actually fully complete the assignment as outlined. And so there's some really interesting implications, and I would be very curious to see how they come about.
Yeah, I was thinking about this, David, and sort of thinking about like some of the implications. And I was thinking, listeners, in context of our business, which is education and do project-based education, which in some ways is alternative higher education. And so we just had a staff meeting actually earlier today where we were taking a bunch of ideas and throwing on the table, and everybody's kind of picking at them and sort of rephrasing them, and resaying them, and rethinking them. And it was a really good brainstorming session. But part of the reason we're putting the ideas at the table was because I started to recognize that I had some internal presuppositions about what people who use our product wanted and the value of it was. And it was starting to fly in the face of the reality and the empirical evidence of what they actually needed. Well, that happens all the time. And in fact, we had a really fascinating discussion with our missions team where somebody who still works for us and worked on the missions team last year said, well, hey, based on my experience last year, people acted this way. And the current admissions team said, yeah, you're right. They did, but they're not acting that way this year. So that's becoming more and more common that, like within a year, consumer behavior is very different. Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of coming and saying, actually, things change pretty quickly. Well, that's fascinating because what we do is the same, but the pieces of it that are valued are looking different. But here from a business standpoint, David, it's actually quite expensive and a real problem. If it takes you a year or a year and a half or 18 months or 24 months to realize that, then a couple more months to dig at it and figure out what's going on, then a couple more months to reset and rebuild, and then to come out with something else. I mean, that could cost you the business. I mean, that's a long turn, right? So I was sitting there thinking, yes, but would it be fascinating if you had an AI that you fed all of your material, and so the AI generally understood what you did and the content you put in it, and then you were able to say, what do you think is the most effective part of our program? What is that, and that'd be interesting if you start to put in like the responses from your students, like, when you ask students to write, what was the best part of your program? And you start pushing that in. And now the AI is like pulling stuff out, and it doesn't have some of these. Now, it's not that AI doesn't have biases. It would obviously clearly have biases on the material that you wrote itself, but it would not have these sort of subterranean biases that, in my mind, there was a way that the students are interacting with our program and the reason that it's valuable and an ideal student. And all of a sudden, I'm confronted with evidence. It's like, actually, I don't think that's ever really been true. But for a whole bunch of complicated human reasons, that's the way I perceived it. AI might be able to cut through some of that and show us that in a whole different way, which, if it could do so, would be really tremendously faster than sort of catching up to it the other way, and yet not creating content, merely reflecting certain aspects of our own content in a way like a brainstorming session that goes, oh yeah, that makes sense. What you just said there that we do, that's actually more valuable than we thought it was. So anyhow, that was a whole different scenario for me. And I was thinking about it and thinking, now there's a use for AI that seems to me much more practical for the world that I live in. AI is obviously quite practical for people screening cancer patients at the moment. But where I don't want it to write me an original article, but I would love for it to summarize 10 articles that I wrote and see patterns in it that I may not have seen because of my own inherent sort of subconscious perspectives. So.
Yeah. I think that kind of goes back to our earlier discussion of what AI is good at, and that is at like looking at data and finding patterns. And that's a really fascinating use case for it. And I think it's one of the reasons why, if we're able to figure out how to fine tune it so that the AI, its own biases on analyzing the data are limited, is that I think just about anybody who works in any sort of scientific field will tell you that you can look at a data sheet and then two different scientists with two different biases will come away from a data sheet with entirely different conclusions, because at the end of the day, they have different experiences, different perspectives on the world that they're coming at it with, and they're going to come away with different conclusions. And AI is potentially could be really helpful in the sense that it doesn't have any of those biases. Now, granted, sometimes those biases can be really helpful and can be in the sense of additional context for the reason for why that study was done in the first place, and some other external circumstances surrounding the data that the AI might not be able to take advantage of. But in this particular case that you're talking about, I think that it has the potential to be really helpful if you already have a solid grasp of the mission and the vision of what you are trying to accomplish with the data, and then you're able to look at it from that perspective, because like you've said, it's especially when you're trying to determine something like consumer behavior, which frankly I would argue is one of the most challenging fields of study that you can go into and try to keep up to date on. Could have some really interesting insights if you're able to apply it well and understand what the purpose of the data is and how to use it.
I was trying to think of some examples, David, and this is contrived, but it's kind of like if I was talking to a friend and I was like, we really need to get a new car. Our cars are wearing out and it's time to replace them. And so my wife and I are just having this big discussion. My wife wants a passenger vehicle so we can, put the kids in and drive them around, stuff like that. But I actually, haul some things occasionally and need the storage space. And so I really want a truck. But there's not a truck that hauls enough people, and there's not really a passenger vehicle that hauls enough material. And so we've been kind of chasing our tails and going round and round about this in terms of what car we should get, right? And so then the friend says, well, hey, I actually know you guys really well. And I know that while you occasionally do need to haul materials, you haul materials like 10% of the time or 20% of the time, 80% of the time, you actually haul people. Have you ever thought about getting a van? Because, the minivan with the stow and go seats, you can flip all the seats down, you can stick your plywood in the back and haul a bunch of material. And as long as it's not messy, no problem. And then most of the time you're going to be using it for seats anyhow. And you go, oh, why? I was thinking about a car or a truck. And now you said van. And that's kind of a smash up of the two. And that's exactly right. And you're right. I only haul material like 20% of the time. And it's one of those things. It's like, you were talking to your wife and you got a vision of a Ford F-150 and you're trying to justify and say like, oh, I got to haul material here and haul material there and do all this and do all that stuff. And all of a sudden you're this person that hauls material all the time. Like, and that's central to your identity. And subconsciously, because you're human, you don't want to come off of that because you're actually fighting for the F-150 and you've also taken some stake with your wife. Well, your wife loves you too, but she's got an identity built around hauling kids around. And so she's trying to kind of defend the same identity subconsciously. So neither of you are really arguing, but both of you are stating how important, and you're finding facts to back up what is already a kind of pre-selected, thing. And then you have this third party that comes in and says, I know you pretty well, and here's the reality. And when you hear it from somebody else, you go, it is actually kind of the reality. And then they say, do this. And you're like, oh yeah, well, that actually makes a lot of sense. Now, that presumes that you have a friend who knows you well enough, B, is willing to take that kind of risk, and C, you're smart enough to ask them. And, I don't know about you, but I can put that on one hand, the amount of times I've been smart enough to do that. But now take that into a business setting or something like that and think about an AI who would be able to sort of identify those patterns quite easily and almost automatically. And all of a sudden, it becomes a really powerful tool, not for creating something new, but for cutting through unconscious perspectives that are not allowing you to see some clear information. That I think is really fascinating. And it's not a way I've thought about using AI before. It's kind of the most interesting one that I've come across so far in my own life. There's lots of interesting things, using AI to screen for cancer is really cool. But in terms of my own personal use, I think, that I could see where that would be really helpful. So.
Yeah. I think it just speaks to the value of having alternative perspectives on things, and the fact that just our nature as humans is to only rely on our perspective and how we understand the world. And being able to recognize other perspectives that are helpful, even if they are limited in their usefulness and their own understanding of context, like AI would be, or even like a friend would be. At the end of the day, considering other perspectives is just extremely helpful. So.
Well, speaking of other perspectives, this has been Alternative Ideas, and we want to take a moment here to say thank you for all those who came along and listened. This really started as an exercise where David and I knew that AI was a big deal, especially in our industry. I wanted to learn some more about it. And honestly, the podcast was a way for us to be disciplined and actually have to once a week focus on some of those headlines and think about them. But also, I think a reaction from both of us to the fact that people were either saying AI was the coolest thing that ever happened ever, or was the most horrible thing that ever happened ever. And I think both of us had kind of an opinion that, that's rarely the case. There's generally a mixed bag here. And so maybe some different ways of looking at it would help us do that. Because I don't know. And I don't know this isn't exactly true, David, but to some extent, I think we are a little bit on each side of those camps, right? I tend to look at AI mostly and go, that's a terrible thing that happened. And I think you've got a little bit of a technical brain that looks at it and goes, that's a really cool thing that happened. And yet, in each of those cases, there's generally an alternative. And so by talking to each other, I think I've seen some opportunities I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And perhaps we've also been able to identify some dangers as well. So we've been delighted for you guys to come along in what was kind of a personal exercise. And then we decided, hey, this might be interesting. Other people might be intrigued. And we've had some really great comments from you, some really great feedback. We're going to move to some other projects now. I feel like we've done some due diligence this summer. And as our academic year kicks up, we're pretty busy in some other things. I don't know if this is the end of the podcast, but at least it's a pause while we sort of see where AI is going next and how we're going to kind of continue to discuss it. But please do pay attention to Unbound, which is where our podcasts are. We have a Be Unbound podcast, which is getting ready to start up again soon, and some other podcast projects that we're working on that we think in the next couple of weeks and probably a month or so will be up and running. And so if this was interesting to you, you will have to put up with my annoying voice, but you will be able to admire David's wonderful radio voice, either in the AI podcast or some other places going forward. So, David, any other thoughts for our listeners as we close out this final episode of this first season?
Yeah, I think that you just put it really well. And I think that what ultimately can make this a really valuable thing, and what I hope people can take away from this, is that even if you are not the foremost expert on something, and even if you don't have just the fullmost understanding of it, I think just having conversations with someone else and actually, as we just talked about, getting other perspectives is really helpful, especially when you're trying to wrestle with a really big, potentially world-changing concept like AI has become. And so just being able to look at different things that are happening and going on around it, and not getting caught up in the media frenzy that tends to happen with issues like this, and just being able to have a grounded conversation with somebody else that is taking it seriously, and you understand where they're coming from too, and being able to say, let's take a look at this and let's see if we're lining up on this, or is my own reaction to this reasonable, and just having conversations about it is a really helpful thing. And so I think that's something that we try to facilitate a lot in Unbound through a lot of the programs that we facilitate for students and training young adults to be able to think critically about things. And one of the most essential parts of doing that is doing that in community, not just trying to figure out how to live a full life on your own. Is that you're designed to be able to work through challenges, even things like understanding what's going on in the world in the context of community. So I think that that's probably not what most people would expect when you would ask what's your takeaway from doing a podcast about artificial intelligence. But I think that's something that, at least for me personally, has been really helpful.
There's something really important about that, David. I mean, like, when faced with artificial intelligence, probably the wisest thing you can do is go talk to a human about it. And that, a C.S. Lewis chatbot is not going to do it. That there is a level of connection and emotional intelligence that happens in relationship with somebody, especially somebody who knows you, that will never be replaced by AI. And I think maybe for me, if I had a final, I think everything you said, David, is excellent. And so I hesitate to add anything much to that, other than to say, I think it took us to this last session for me, this last episode, and this idea of intelligence amplifying. I'll close with this little thing. I am skeptical of technology. And so one of the things that I try to do as a personal discipline is that, first of all, I use phones until they stop working, which is a little inconvenient when that happens. But so I'm not buying the latest gadget all the time. And I'm not saying you shouldn't. I'm just saying personally for me, that's a better way for me to use the technology. And then when I replace the phone, the first thing I do is I delete every single app off of it that I can possibly scrub, and I try to hide the rest. And then over the next couple of days and weeks, I only replace the apps that I actually use. And what I've discovered is that I only use a handful of apps, and then there's a few more that sort of find their way in over time as I need them for special applications. And I'm not making any claims here that this is the right way to do it. I'm just saying that this is a little discipline for me to remind myself that I use my technology doesn't use me. And so consequently, it's like, instead of going to bash in a bunch of nails because I have a hammer, I first decide I want to see the nails first and then go look and say, what's the best thing to drive those into the wall? Oh, it's a hammer. So I should go get the hammer. And so there's an element of kind of, having a bit of a screen and saying, am I using it or is it using me? And do I have a reason for it? And for me, this the tool for AI has been this IA thing, intelligence amplifying, that we just talked about. That, if this is intelligence amplifying, then this is a use of AI that I'm pretty intrigued by. If this is not intelligence amplifying, but instead, so here's where the line would be drawn. If I ask AI to write an article, and I expect it to write an article that I'm going to use, I don't think that's intelligence amplifying. That's a whole different thing, right? But if I write an article and then submit it to an AI and ask it to check it for grammar, or ask it to, if we had one of these closed systems and I said, are there any other points that you think would be interesting to put in here? And it's pulling from our own data set to do that. That is intelligence amplifying. That's using our own ideas and making them more efficient in some fashion. And I would say that I think feels like a very positive use of it. So I don't know if that's a magic bullet. I'm not saying that's the final thing. But for me, one of the things as we've gone through this journey over the last 9 episodes is that kind of boiled down to this, here's an interesting tool to be able to sort, is AI usable? Is this a good use of AI or not? And a question I'm going to be asking is it amplifying my intelligence or is it replacing it? If it's amplifying it, good. If it's replacing it, probably a little suspect.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent note for it to end on. So, yeah, once again, thank you. If you have joined us for this long, and if you have made it to the end of this episode or any of our other episodes, we really appreciate you tagging along for this. And as Jonathan mentioned, we have plenty of other projects that are going to be coming out soon. If you want to check some of those out, visit our website, beunbound.us. It's linked down below. And we would love for you to engage with us in some of our other programs and some of the other content that we put out there. So, we hope to see you again and that you take the opportunity to listen to some of that again very soon. So thank you.
And as we finish up, a special note that we'll publicly put on here to Michael Caprera, who's done the editing and all the sound work for this podcast. It would not happen without him. And he is silently behind the scenes, but deserves some public recognition as we close out this last episode. If you're interested in anything that has to do with alternative higher education or high school or looking for practical solutions, also check out beunbound.us. The alternative ideas that we bring to the podcast, we also try to systematize and bring to our students in a way that we do hope is intelligence amplifying. And so we'd invite you to come and join in that. Until next time and next season, we'll talk to you all later.